The mountain burned with a fire that never went out, and at its peak sat a queen who had forgotten how to hope. Queen Virith was the last great ruler of the Drukhari, a species of massive dragon-like beings who had once commanded respect across the galaxy. But now she sat alone in her palace of black stone and watched the stars. With empty eyes, 3 years had passed since the raiders came. 3 years since the Korvax syndicate destroyed her clutch of 7 eggs. 3 years since she heard the screams of her young dying before they ever had a chance to live. She had been the proudest queen in Drukhari history. A warrior who united the volcanic world of Paranthus under one banner. But grief had broken something inside her that could never be repaired. Her scales, once bright as molten gold, had faded to a dull bronze, and the fire in her chest burned. Cold with rage instead of warm with love, the Galactic Council sent diplomats every few months. Ships full of aliens who wanted to talk about trade and alliances and the future. But Virith burned their vessels before they could land and sent their ashes scattering into the void. She wanted nothing from the galaxy that had stood by and watched her children die. Her advisors begged her to reconsider, to rejoin the council and rebuild their empire. But she silenced them with a single look from her ancient eyes. "Let them all burn," she whispered into the darkness. "Let them feel what I feel." Thousands of light years away, on a small blue planet called Earth, a 12-year-old boy named Danny Carter woke up to the sound of birds singing outside his window. He lived in a quiet town in Montana with his mother Laura, a xenobiologist who worked for the Earth Defense Coalition studying alien life forms. Danny's father had been a pilot, a brave man who flew into battle during the First Contact War and never came home. And even though 5 years had passed, Danny still kept his father's flight jacket hanging in his closet. He was a quiet boy, the kind who preferred the company of animals to people. And he spent most of his summer days volunteering at a local wildlife rescue center where he helped nurse injured birds and mammals back to health. There was something about hurt creatures that called to him, something that made him want to wrap them in warmth and tell them everything would be okay. His mother said he had a gift, a way of calming even the most frightened animals with just his voice and his gentle hands. "You have your father's heart," she told him once, and Danny held those words close like a treasure. On this particular morning, Laura came into his room with a strange look on her face, a mixture of excitement and worry that made Danny sit up in bed. "Something happened," she said. "A Drukhari scout ship crashed in the Rocky Mountains last night, and the Coalition wants me on the recovery team." Danny had heard of the Drukhari, the fearsome dragon aliens who had cut themselves off from the rest of the galaxy, and his eyes went wide with curiosity. "Can I come?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Absolutely not," Laura said firmly. "This is dangerous work, Danny, and the Drukhari are not friendly to outsiders." She kissed his forehead and told him to stay home and take care of the house while she was gone. And Danny nodded like a good son and watched her pack her equipment. But as soon as she left for the Coalition transport hub, he made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. He grabbed his backpack, stuffed it with snacks and a flashlight and his father's old compass, and he followed her. The transport ship was massive, a military vessel designed to carry troops and equipment across long distances, and Danny found it surprisingly easy to sneak aboard while the soldiers were busy loading cargo. He hid himself in a storage compartment behind some supply crates and waited, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. The ship lifted off with a rumble that shook his bones, and Danny pressed his hand against the cold metal wall and thought about his father flying through the stars. "I just want to see," he whispered to himself. "I just want to understand." The flight to the crash site took only an hour, and when the transport landed in a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, Danny crept out of his hiding spot and followed the team from a distance. What he saw took his breath away. The Drukhari ship had torn a massive gash through the forest, leaving a trail of burning trees and scorched earth. And at the center of the destruction lay a creature unlike anything Danny had ever imagined. She was beautiful and terrible all at once. A dragon with scales the color of deep red wine and wings that spread wider than a house. But she was also broken and bleeding, and barely alive soldiers surrounded her with weapons raised, shouting orders and calling for backup. And Danny watched as the alien warrior lashed out with her tail and sent 3 men flying through the air. "She is too dangerous," one of the commanders yelled. "We need to put her down before she kills anyone else." But Danny noticed something the soldiers did not see. Clutched against the dragon's chest, protected by her massive claws, was a small oval object that glowed with a faint inner light, and Danny did not think about the danger or the consequences. He simply acted on instinct, the same instinct that drove him to help every wounded creature he had ever found. He stepped out of the shadows and walked toward the dying alien while every adult around him screamed at him to stop. The dragon's eyes, golden and ancient and full of pain, fixed on him as he approached, and for a moment the world went completely silent. "It is okay," Danny said softly, the way he spoke to frightened animals. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." The dragon stared at him, a breath coming in ragged gasps, and something in her gaze shifted from rage to confusion, to something that might have been hope. She opened her claws just slightly, revealing the cracked and cooling egg beneath. Danny understood without words what she was asking. He knelt beside her, removed his jacket, and carefully wrapped it around the egg, cradling it against his chest to share his warmth. "I will keep it safe," he promised. "I will not let anything happen to it." The dragon warrior spoke for the first time, her voice deep and rumbling like distant thunder. "What is your name?" "Small one." "Danny," he answered. "My name is Danny Carter." She closed her eyes and whispered something in her own language, a word that sounded like fire and wind and ancient mountains. "Pirithkai," she breathed, "little firekeeper," and somewhere across the stars, in her palace of black stone, Queen Virith felt something stir in the ashes of her broken heart. The soldiers did not know what to do with the strange scene before them. A human child kneeling beside a wounded alien warrior, cradling an egg like it was the most precious thing in the universe. Laura Carter pushed through the crowd of armed men and felt her heart stop when she saw her son. "Danny!" she screamed, running toward him with terror in her eyes. "Get away from her right now." But Danny did not move, and neither did the dragon. "Mom, wait," he said calmly, never taking his eyes off the egg in his arms. "She is not going to hurt me. She just wants someone to help her baby." The Drakari warrior, whose name was Keseth, watched the human woman approach with cautious eyes. But she made no move to attack. She was too weak, too broken. And something about the boy had touched a part of her soul she thought had died long ago. "Your offspring," Keseth rasped, looking at Laura. "He has the heart of a firekeeper, a protector of young. This is rare among any species." Laura knelt beside Danny, her hands shaking as she checked him for injuries. And when she found none, she wrapped her arms around him and held him tight. "You foolish, brave, wonderful boy," she whispered into his hair. "You could have been killed, but I was not," Danny said simply. "And now we have to help her." The coalition medics moved in carefully, their equipment ready to treat the wounded alien. And Keseth allowed them to approach only because Danny asked her. She had killed 3 soldiers in her fear and pain. But this small human had walked through her fire without hesitation. And she did not understand why as the medics worked to stabilize her wounds. Keseth spoke to Danny in a voice that grew stronger with each passing moment. "You must know what you now carry," she said, her golden eyes fixed on the egg. "That is not just any offspring. That is the last fertile egg in existence, the only hope for my entire species." Danny looked down at the egg, feeling its warmth through his jacket, and he held it a little tighter. "What happened to the others?" He asked. Ekasith's eyes filled with a pain so deep it seemed to swallow all the light around her. The Korvax Syndicate. She growled. They came to our world 3 years ago and released a plague that killed every unhatched egg on Paranthus. Our queen lost 7 young in a single night, and she has never recovered. Lara listened with growing horror as the story unfolded. We thought it was a natural disease. Kasith continued. We thought the universe had simply decided our time was over, but I discovered the truth. The plague was a bioweapon created by the Korvax to destroy us. Why would they do that? Danny asked, his young face twisted with confusion. Because we refused to join their empire, Kasith answered. Because our queen told them that Drakari bow to no one, and they decided that if they could not control us, they would end us. She coughed, dark blood staining her lips. But she forced herself to keep speaking. I stole this egg from a Korvax research facility, she explained. They had taken it from my daughter before they killed her. They were studying it to make their weapon even stronger. But I got it back. Danny felt tears burning in his eyes as he imagined what Kasith had been through. A grandmother fighting alone against an empire to save the last piece of her family. I was trying to bring it home to Queen Virith, Kasith said. She needs to know the truth about what the Korvax did, and she needs to see that there is still hope. Then we will help you get there, Danny said firmly. Laura opened her mouth to protest, but Danny turned to her with eyes that looked so much like his father's that she could not speak. Mom, they killed her babies, he said quietly. They killed all of them except this one, and if we do not help her, they will kill this one too. The coalition commander, a stern man named Colonel Webb, approached with his arms crossed over his chest. The Drakari have refused all contact with the council for 3 years, he said gruffly. Queen Virith has burned every ship we sent. What makes you think she will welcome us now? Kasith shook her head slowly. She will not, the warrior admitted. My queen has been consumed by her grief. She sees enemies everywhere. But if I can show her this egg and tell her the truth about the Korvax, maybe I can reach whatever part of her still remembers how to hope. And if you cannot? Colonel Webb asked, then she will kill us all, Kasith said simply. But it is a risk I must take. The colonel turned to Lara with a heavy sigh. This is above my pay grade, he muttered. I will contact Coalition Command and see what they want to do. Over the next 2 days, messages flew back and forth between Earth and the Coalition headquarters. And eventually, a decision was made. The Coalition would provide a ship to transport Kasith back to Paranthus, along with a small diplomatic team that would attempt to establish contact with Queen Virith. Kasith refused. I do not trust your soldiers, she said bluntly. I have seen how adults react to my kind, with fear and weapons and lies. They will say the wrong thing, and my queen will burn them. She turned her gaze to Danny, who had not left the egg side for even a moment. I trust only him, Kasith declared. The Firekeeper will come with me, or I will go alone. Lavra felt her world crumbling around her. He is 12 years old. She cried. He is a child. You cannot ask me to send my son across the galaxy to meet a queen who has gone mad with grief. I am not asking you, Kasith replied. I am asking him. Danny looked at his mother, and in that moment, he seemed so much older than his years. Dad would have gone, he said softly. He always said that doing the right thing is never easy, but we have to do it anyway. Lavra felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at her son. This brave and foolish boy who had so much of his father in him. Then I am coming too, she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. If my son is going to save a species, his mother is going to be there to watch. Danny smiled and hugged her tight. And somewhere in the depths of space, the engines of destiny began to turn 3 days later. A small coalition vessel lifted off from Earth with 4 passengers aboard. A wounded Drakari warrior, a xenobiologist, a 12-year-old boy, and an egg that carried the hope of an entire civilization. The stars waited to see what they would bring. The journey to Paranthus would take 2 weeks through the vast emptiness between stars, and Danny spent every moment of it learning about the egg he had sworn to protect. Kestith grew stronger each day as her wounds healed, and she watched the human boy with a mixture of wonder and confusion that she could not quite explain. You talked to it, she observed one evening as Danny sat in the ship's small cargo hold. The egg nestled in a makeshift nest of blankets. You tell it stories and sing it songs. Do you think it can hear you? Danny looked up at her with those earnest brown eyes that seemed too wise for such a young face. I do not know, he admitted, but when I was little and I was scared, my dad used to talk to me and sing to me, and it always made me feel better. So maybe it helps. Kestith settled down beside him, her massive form curling around the nest like a protective wall. Drakari eggs are not like the eggs of lesser creatures, she explained. The young inside can sense emotions. They feel the love or the fear of those around them, and it shapes who they become. Danny's eyes went wide with understanding. So when I talk to her, she really can feel it? Her? Kestith asked, tilting her great head. I think it is a girl, Danny said with a small smile. I do not know why, I just feel it. Kestith studied him for a long moment, then let out a low rumble that might have been a laugh. You may be right, Firekeeper. Our seers used to say that those with pure hearts could sense the spirits of the unborn. From that day on, Danny became even more devoted to the egg, talking to it about everything. His life on Earth, his favorite animals at the rescue center, the father he had lost and the mother he loved. The stars outside the window and the adventure they were on Mora watched her son from the doorway of the cargo hold, her heart swelling with pride and breaking with fear at the same time. He is remarkable, Kestith said, appearing beside her. I have lived for 200 years and traveled to 100 worlds, but I have never seen anyone like him. He has always been this way, Lava replied softly. Even as a baby, he seemed to understand things that others could not see. His father used to say Danny was born with his heart on the outside. Kestith nodded slowly. That is a dangerous way to live, she observed. Those who feel everything often suffer more than those who feel nothing. I know, Lava whispered, but I would not change him for anything. The days passed in a rhythm of conversations and meals and long hours staring at the stars, and Danny learned more about the Drakari and their tragic history. Kestith told him about Queen Virith, how she had once been the wisest and kindest ruler their people had ever known, a queen who valued life above all things and worked tirelessly to build a peaceful empire. She was not always full of rage, Kestith said sadly. Before the Korvax came, she would spend hours playing with the hatchlings in the palace gardens. She knew every young one by name, and she loved them all as if they were her own. What changed? Danny asked, though he already knew the answer. Grief, Kestith replied. Grief can turn even the brightest soul into something dark and twisted. When she lost her clutch, she lost herself. Danny thought about his own grief, the hole in his heart where his father used to be, and he understood. Maybe she just needs someone to remind her who she used to be, he said. Quiet Lycoseth looked at him with something that might have been hope. Maybe, she agreed. Maybe that is exactly what she needs. On the 12th day of their journey, everything changed. The ship's alarms began screaming in the middle of the night. Red lights flashing and sirens wailing as Larva rushed to the cockpit to see what was happening. Korvax warships. The ship's pilot shouted, his hands flying over the controls. 3 of them. They must have been tracking us. Danny grabbed the egg and held it against his chest as the ship shook with the impact of enemy. Firekeseth roared with fury and tried to reach the weapon systems, but her wounds had not fully healed and she collapsed in pain. We cannot outrun them, the pilot yelled. They are too fast. Laura's mind raced as she tried to think of a solution. And then she remembered something from her xenobiology training. Head for that asteroid field. She commanded, pointing at the navigation screen. Korvax ships are built for open combat. Their maneuverability is terrible in tight spaces. The pilot hesitated for only a moment before banking hard toward the swirling mass of rocks ahead. The next few minutes were the most terrifying of Danny's young life. The ship twisted and turned through the asteroid field, dodging massive boulders while the Korvax fired blindly behind them. And Danny held the egg and whispered promises that everything would be okay. One of the enemy ships crashed into an asteroid and exploded in a ball of fire. Then another clipped a rock and spun out of control, but the third ship stayed on their tail, its weapons tearing holes in their hull. We are not going to make it. The pilot screamed, but then, like a miracle, they burst out of the asteroid field and saw a massive red planet looming before them. Parenthesis. We just need to reach the atmosphere. Kesseth shouted. My people will see us and send help. The ship dove toward the planet, flames licking at its damaged hull as it entered the atmosphere. And the last Korvax warship finally fell back. Unwilling to face the Drakari defenses, they had made it, but their victory came at a cost. The ship was too damaged to land safely, and no matter what the pilot tried, they could not slow down enough to survive the impact. Brace yourselves. Laura screamed, grabbing Danny and wrapping her body around him and the egg. The ship hit the ground with a terrible crash. Metal screaming and glass shattering and the world spinning in chaos. And then everything went dark. Danny woke to the sound of wind howling across a barren landscape of black rock and red sky. His mother lay unconscious beside him, bleeding from a cut on her forehead but still breathing. And Kesseth was pulling herself from the wreckage with a look of grim determination. The egg was still in Danny's arms, unbroken and warm. Where are we? Danny asked, his voice shaking. Kesseth looked up at the massive mountain that loomed above them, a peak wreathed in flames and smoke and ancient power. We are in the shadow of the Queen's palace, she said grimly. And she knows we are here. High above them, a roar echoed across the mountains, a sound of fury and grief and madness that shook the very stones. Beneath their feet, Queen Virith was coming, and she did not come to welcome them. The ground shook with each beat of massive wings as Queen Virith descended from her mountain palace. And Danny understood for the first time what it truly meant to face a creature of legend. She was enormous, larger than any building Danny had ever seen, with scales that shimmered like rivers of liquid gold and eyes that burned with the fury of dying stars. Wingspan blocked out the red sun of Paranthus, casting a shadow over the crashed ship and the tiny beings who stood before her. Kesseth dropped to her knees and pressed her forehead against the ground in a gesture of absolute submission. My queen, she called out, her voice desperate and pleading. I bring news of the greatest importance. I bring proof of who murdered our young. But Virith did not seem to hear her. The queen's ancient eyes were fixed on the two humans, these small, soft creatures who had dared to set foot on her sacred world. And her chest began to glow with the fire building inside her. More invaders, Virith growled, her voice like thunder rolling across the mountains. More liars and thieves come to mock my grief. No, my queen, Kesseth cried. They helped me. They saved me when I crashed on their world. Please listen to me. Laura had regained consciousness and was struggling to her feet, blood still dripping from the wound on her forehead. And she pulled Danny behind her in a futile attempt to protect him. Stay back, she whispered to her son. Stay behind me. But Danny could not stay back. Not when he saw the pain beneath the queen's rage. Not when he recognized the same grief he had felt when his father died. He stepped around his mother and walked toward the massive dragon, the egg still cradled against his chest. Danny, no. Laura, screamed. Virith's eyes snapped to the small human approaching her, And for a moment she was so surprised that she forgot to be angry. "What is this?" she hissed, smoke curling from her nostrils. "A human child dares to approach me?" Danny stopped 10 feet from the queen's massive head and looked up at her without fear. "I know why you are so angry," he said quietly. "I know why you want to burn everything." Virith lowered her head until her eye was level with Danny's face, an eye larger than his entire body, and she studied him with cold fury. "You know nothing, little creature," she snarled. "You cannot possibly understand what I have lost." "I lost my dad," Danny replied, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "He was a pilot, and he flew away one day to fight in a war. And he never came home." Something flickered in the queen's burning gaze, a crack in the armor of her rage. "I was so angry," Danny continued. "I wanted to break everything. I wanted to scream at the universe for taking him away from me. But being angry did not bring him back. It just made me feel worse." Virith pulled back slightly, her flames dimming just a fraction. "Your loss is nothing compared to mine," she said. But her voice had lost some of its thunder. "I lost 7 children. 7 young who never got to see the stars. 7 pieces of my heart torn away in a single night." "I know," Danny said softly. "And I am so sorry." He lifted the egg slightly, letting the queen see what he carried. "But this one is still alive," he said. "Cassith's granddaughter, the last egg in the whole galaxy. And I promised I would keep her safe." Virith's eyes went wide as she recognized what the boy held. And for the first time in 3 years, her rage gave way to something else entirely. "That is impossible," she whispered, her voice breaking. "All the eggs were destroyed. The plague took them all." "Not all of them," Cassith said, rising from her knees and approaching her queen. "The Korvax took this one before the plague was released. They wanted to study it, but I stole it back. I killed dozens of their soldiers to get it back." Virith turned to her warrior with eyes that glistened with tears she had not shed in years. "The plague," she breathed. "You said you have proof." "The plague was not natural, my queen," Cassith said, her voice thick with emotion. "The Korvax created it. They engineered a bioweapon specifically designed to kill our unborn. They murdered our children because we refused to bow to their empire." The queen's grief transformed into something darker, something sharper, and her scales began to glow with inner fire. "They killed my babies," she said slowly, each word dripping with hatred. "They killed them on purpose." "Yes, my queen." Virith threw back her head and released a roar that shook the mountains themselves. A sound of rage and sorrow and terrible promise that echoed across the entire planet. But then she looked back at Danny, at this small human child who stood before her without trembling, and she spoke in a voice that was almost gentle. "Why did you come here, Firekeeper?" she asked, using the name Cassith had given him. "Why did you risk your life for an egg that is not even your own kind?" Danny looked down at the egg, feeling its warmth against his heart. And then he looked back up at the queen. "Because she needed someone," he answered simply. "Because I could feel how scared she was. And I did not want her to be alone." Virith stared at him for a long moment. And then she did something that shocked everyone watching. She bowed her massive head until her nose nearly touched the ground, lowering herself before a 12-year-old human boy. "You have done what no one else could," she said quietly. "You have given me something to protect instead of something to avenge." She raised her head and looked at the egg with eyes full of longing. "May I hold her?" she asked, and the request was so humble, so vulnerable, that Laura felt tears streaming down her face. Danny nodded and stepped forward, carefully placing the egg in the curve of the queen's massive claws. And Virith cradled it against her chest with a tenderness that seemed impossible for a creature of her size. "I had forgotten," she whispered, gazing at the glowing egg. "I had forgotten what it felt like to have hope." For several minutes, No one spoke as the queen held the egg and wept, golden tears falling like rain onto the black rocks below. But the moment of peace was shattered by a thunderous boom from the sky. Danny looked up to see dozens of ships breaking through the clouds. Warships covered in the black and red markings of the Korvax Syndicate. "They followed us," Cassith growled, spreading her wings despite her injuries. "They followed us here to finish what they started." Virith's tears turned to fire as she looked at the approaching fleet. And when she spoke, her voice carried across the entire planet. "They come to destroy my last hope," she said, her scales blazing with golden light. "They come to murder the only child I have left." She turned to her warriors, who had been gathering around the palace since her roar. "We will not let them," she declared. And this time her rage had a purpose. "Today we fight not for revenge, but for the future." The sky exploded with fire as the battle for Paranthus began. The Korvax fleet descended upon Paranthus like a swarm of metal locusts, their weapons raining fire down upon the volcanic world below. Queen Virith took to the sky with her warriors, dozens of Drukhari rising to meet the enemy with flames and fury. But Danny could see that they were outnumbered 10-1. "There are too many of them," Lavra said, pulling Danny close as explosions lit up the red sky. "The Drukhari cannot win this alone." Danny watched the battle unfold above him, watched the brave dragons fall one by one as the Korvax ships cut them down with cold efficiency. And he felt something burning in his chest that had nothing to do with the heat of the planet. He thought about his father, about how he had flown into battle against impossible odds, because it was the right thing to do. He thought about all the stories his dad used to tell him, stories about humans who stood up for others, even when they were scared, even when they knew they might not survive. "And he made a decision, Mom," he said, turning to Laura with eyes full of desperate hope. "You have to call Earth. You have to tell them to send help." Laura looked at her son with tears in her eyes. "Danny, the Coalition has no reason to help the Drukhari," she said gently. "We are not allies. We have no treaties, no agreements. They will not send soldiers to die for strangers." "Then tell them to do it anyway," Danny replied. "Tell them that is what makes us human." Laura stared at her son for a long moment, seeing so much of his father in those determined eyes. And then she nodded. She pulled out her emergency communicator and broadcast a message on every frequency she could reach. A message that would travel across the stars to the ears of anyone willing to listen. "This is Laura Carter of the Earth Defense Coalition," she said, her voice strong despite her fear. "I am on the planet Paranthus, where the Drukhari people are being attacked by the Korvax Syndicate. They are outnumbered and they are dying. And I am asking, I am begging, for anyone who can hear this to send help." She paused, looking at Danny, and then continued. "The Drukhari never asked for our help. They never wanted our friendship. But right now they are fighting to protect the last child of their entire species. And if we let them die alone, we will have to live with that shame forever." The message ended, and Laura lowered the communicator with trembling hands. "I do not know if anyone heard that," she admitted. "Someone will," Danny said with a certainty he did not fully understand. "Someone will come, thousands of light years away." In the command center of the Earth Defense Fleet, Commander Ryan Brooks listened to the message with a heavy heart. Was a soldier who had fought in 3 wars and seen friends die in his arms. And he knew better than most that the galaxy was not kind to those who took unnecessary risks, but he also remembered why he had become a soldier in the first place. To protect those who could not protect themselves. He turned to his crew with a look of grim determination. "Set a course for Paranthus," he ordered. "Maximum speed." "Sir," his second officer protested. "The Council has not authorized any military action if we go." "We go without their blessing," Brooks smiled grimly. "Then I guess they will have to court-martial me when we get back," he replied. "Assuming we get back," He activated the fleet-wide communication system and spoke to every ship under his command. "This is Commander Brooks," he said. "I am about to disobey a direct order and take this fleet into battle against the Korvax Syndicate. Anyone who wants to stay behind is free to do so. No one will think less of you." He paused and then added, "But if you want to find out what being human really means, follow me to Paranthus." Not a single ship stayed behind on Paranthus. The battle had become desperate. Queen Virith fought like a demon, her flames carving paths of destruction through the enemy fleet. But even she could not hold back the tide forever. She had taken a dozen wounds, her golden scales scorched black by enemy fire, and she knew that the end was coming. "Keseth," she roared, tossing the egg to her warrior. "Take the child and the humans. Find a place to hide. Do not let the Korvax take her." "I will not leave you, my queen," Keseth shouted back. "That is an order." Virith bellowed, "The egg must survive. Nothing else matters." Keseth hesitated, tears streaming from her golden eyes. And then she grabbed the egg and gathered Danny and Laura under her wings. "Come," she said, her voice breaking. "We have to go." Danny looked up at the sky one last time, watching the queen fight alone against impossible odds. And he felt his heart breaking. "Someone will come," he whispered again. "Someone has to come." And then, like an answer to a prayer, the sky lit up with a different kind of light. Dozens of ships burst out of hyperspace, ships bearing the blue and white colors of the Earth Defense Fleet. And they crashed into the Korvax formation like a hammer striking glass. "This is Commander Ryan Brooks of the Earth Defense Fleet." A voice boomed across every frequency. "Korvax forces, you are ordered to stand down immediately. Any ship that continues its attack will be destroyed." The Korvax did not stand down. What followed was the fiercest battle Danny had ever witnessed. Human ships and Drakari warriors fighting side by side against a common enemy. Strangers becoming allies in the crucible of fire. Commander Brooks flew his ship directly into the heart of the enemy fleet, drawing their fire away from the wounded queen. While his pilots picked off Korvax vessels one by one with surgical precision, it was not enough to guarantee victory. But it was enough to turn the tide. The Korvax commander, seeing his fleet crumbling around him, finally gave the order to retreat. And the surviving enemy ships fled into the darkness of space. Silence fell over Paranthus, broken only by the crackling of flames and the heavy breathing of exhausted warriors. Queen Virith descended from the sky, her wounds bleeding freely, and she landed before the humans who had come to save her people. Commander Brooks stepped out of his ship and stood at attention before the Dragon Queen, a soldier facing a legend. "Why?" Virith asked, her voice thick with confusion and emotion. "Why did you come? We are nothing to you. We gave you no reason to risk your lives for us." Brooks glanced at Danny, who stood clutching the egg with a smile on his face, and then looked back at the queen. "That boy sent a message," he said simply. "He said that humans do not protect others because of what we can gain. We do it because it is right." He paused and then added, "He was right." Virith stared at the commander for a long moment, and then she did something no Drakari queen had done in 10,000 years. She bowed to an outsider. "You have earned something today that can never be taken back," she said. "The friendship of the Drakari, an alliance that will last until the stars themselves burn out." She turned to Danny and knelt before him, her massive head lowering until they were eye to eye. "And you, little firekeeper," she said gently, "you have given me my heart back. I name you Pirithkin, brother of dragons, and your name will be remembered for as long as our people exist." 1 week later, the egg hatched in the warmth of the queen's palace. Danny was there when it happened, watching as a tiny golden dragon broke free from her shell and looked around at the world for the first time. She saw Danny and chirped, reaching toward him with tiny claws, recognizing the voice that had kept her company through all those long days in space. "She knows you," Virith said with wonder. She knows your heart. Danny held out his hand, and the little dragon climbed onto his palm and curled up there. Warm and safe and loved. What will you name her? He asked. Virith smiled, the first true smile she had worn in 3 years. Daneth, she said. It means the one kept warm by the firekeeper. Danny felt tears rolling down his cheeks as he looked at the tiny creature who had changed everything. In the records of both Earth and Paranthus, it would be written that the greatest alliance in galactic history began not with treaties or trade agreements, but with a boy who held an egg and refused to let go, and whenever anyone asked how humans had earned the eternal friendship of the fearsome Drakari, the answer was always the same. They came when no one else would. They fought when they had nothing to gain. They proved that the smallest heart can hold the greatest fire, and that is what it means to be human.